Lecture number 3 for Western Civ 1. Title of this, the focus of this lecture is Hebrew and later Near Eastern Roots of Western Civilization. As we begin, I'd like to begin with devotional thought as we see God working in time. What we find in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 and following is that Abraham, who lived in Mesopotamia, born in Ur, moved later to Haran, and subsequently was called by God to leave the land that he knew and to go to a place that God would show him. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, we read that the Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." Then subsequently what we have are 7 blessings, where God tells Abram that I'll make you a great nation and I'll bless you. And then the final of those blessings is that all the peoples on earth will be blessed by you. What's interesting is that we today are children of Abraham as we in faith follow God's call on our life and trust Him. And we're blessed by Abraham as through his seed, through his descendant Jesus, we have hope for eternity, and this is the way that people the world over have reason for hope. God works particularly through the ancient Hebrew people, and we're blessed by them today, and they contribute a great deal to Western civilization. So we want to begin today by thinking about the origins of the ancient Hebrews and how they become later the Israelites and have the kingdom of Israel. As we pursue our knowledge of the ancient Hebrews and think about how they contribute to Western civilization, we need to think first about sources. And the biblical account is our primary source for the origins of the Hebrew. And in the book of Genesis, we find that Abraham began in Mesopotamia amongst an Aramean group of people in northern Mesopotamia at Haran. And this patriarch Abraham, who lives at the end of the 3rd millennium, migrated to the land of Canaan. This is the land that God showed him. And as he moved from Haran, he came first to Shechem, then on near Bethel, to settle eventually in Hebron by the oaks of Mamre, down in the Negev in the southern part of Israel. As Abram moves to this land, what we find is there's a number of cultural distinctions that begin to emerge that set this people apart. First of all, Abram worships Yahweh, unlike his father Terah, who had been a polygamist, not a polygamist, a polytheist. And what we find is that he's a monotheist. He worships one God. And Abraham serves as something of a priest for his family. Another distinction that emerges along the way here with Abraham is the practice of circumcision. There'll be a number of cultural distinctives that the Israelites will have subsequent to the revelations given to Moses, but they're called to be a distinctive people, and this will be part of their legacy in world history. As Abram came to live amongst the Canaanites, there are a variety of different types of Canaanites and people that were there. He would particularly pursue a pastoral strategy for subsistence, and he was an affluent, powerful person who was in competition for resources in the land, but lived as a stranger amongst the people of Canaan. He would have children, but these children would set up a long-term struggle that continues today, as he had sons Ishmael and Isaac, the father of the Arabs and the father of the Jews. But the patriarchs, these fathers that led Hebrew families, give their name to a period of biblical history, the patriarchal period where you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob ruling over their families in Canaan. And they're there for a period of a couple hundred years until, in a time of crisis, what we find in the biblical account is that we move to the next period of Hebrew history when they go to live in Egypt. They find refuge in Egypt in a time of famine, and God's promise to Abraham is continued. They don't starve to death in Canaan. Instead, through the circumstances that develop, that we read about in Genesis, Joseph A younger son is gone to Egypt, and he provides a means whereby his father Jacob and all of his brothers are able to survive, and their numbers are able to grow in Egypt over a period of a few hundred years. So when Joseph goes down into Egypt, it's around the year, when he's sold into Egypt is about 1898 BC. By the time Jacob comes to Egypt, it's about 1876. And so they're going to be in Egypt for a period of about 430 years until they leave Egypt. During that time period, their numbers swell tremendously, and they come to be seen as something of a threat in Egypt. While they were welcomed as guests into Egypt, what we find in the early part of Exodus is that there came to be a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph and how he'd saved Egypt and made Egypt powerful. The Hebrew looked a whole lot like a group of foreigners who'd come from Canaan, known as the Hyksos, who had dominated Egypt for over 100 years. And so the Egyptians, under Ahmose, begin to oppress foreigners like the Hebrew. And the result is that they're being worked to death, with a planned genocide going on in Egypt, doing all sorts of hard labor, making mud bricks. They were not making pyramids, contrary to some movies showing this, because the movies fail to recognize that the pyramids were already hundreds of years old by the time Abraham came to Egypt much, much earlier. So when the Israelites are in bondage, the pyramid building age in Egypt is already concluded. Now, we don't find much about the Israelites in ancient Egyptian texts. This is not terribly surprising. The Egyptians don't record their failures. They like to highlight their victories. And so in Egyptian texts, we don't find any references to Moses or the Israelites leaving Egypt as a result of the plagues that came. Those things are kept quiet. Some individuals are rubbed out of Egyptian history as they take hard stones and basically chip away names of people that they wanted to erase from their memory. But amongst Egyptian texts, an early text that speaks of Israel is something called the Merneptah stele. Sometimes it's known as the Israel stele. It comes from around the period of 1220 BC, and it claims Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. Basically, Merneptah, the son of Ramses II, is claiming to have committed genocide. Obviously, that was an inflated claim. Another extra-biblical text that we'll find will be that of the Assyrians. And so we find on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser a depiction of King Jehu of Israel bowing down and serving Shalmaneser around the year 842. This is the earliest depiction that we have preserved right now of a Israelite king. So there's not a whole lot of extra biblical accounts. We're dependent largely upon the biblical accounts and physical evidence that we might find otherwise. But as far as trying to think about where the Israelites come from, people have studied their language. People have sometimes brought their own philosophies to bear to explain how these Israelites might come into the land, and typically that teaches more about the people who's doing the interpreting than the Israelites of old. Very clearly, the Israelites did come to live in Canaan, and their experience in Canaan, we see in the patriarchal period in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was one where they were seen as outsiders, a minority within a larger Canaanite milieu, a combination of people that lived there. And in the time of Jacob, they immigrated to Egypt. And as they immigrated to Egypt, they, as I mentioned earlier, they had survived and thrived there. Subsequently, they left Egypt in what in biblical history we know as the period of the Exodus. And this was a tumultuous period during which they were led by the prophet Moses. And Moses is a prophet who is born around the year 1526, and he's going to lead them out of Egypt around 1447 in the Exodus. And for the next 40 years or so, they're going to be making their way towards Canaan to claim the promise that God had made that they would have the land. This would be a very formative time as they're led by Moses. It's going to greatly shape their cultural identity and their distinctiveness. They're going to struggle to survive. They're going to depend upon God to survive in the wilderness. Eventually, they come to the land of promise, and they're going to claim that land following the time period of the death of Moses around 1406, and then they'll subsequently be led by Joshua into a period of conquest where they're going to take over the land and the resources of Canaan and make it their own. Following the time period of this conquest, where the various tribes of Israelites made up of the sons of Jacob take their land, we are followed by a period where the Israelites were ruled by judges. This is the period that lasts from about 1375 until about 1050 BC, where there's a series of judges that rule over Israelites in different sectors of the country. What we find is the Israelites aren't hanging together too terribly well during this period, and their existence is threatened by a variety of outside challenges to their existence. God in His providence preserves them by raising up judges. The last of the judges was the prophet Samuel. The prophet Samuel led the people for some time, but the people wanted to have a king like the neighboring peoples, their rivals. And so the next period of Israelite history is known as that of the United Monarchy. This is a period that lasts from about 1050 until about 930 BC. The united monarchs of the Hebrew people would be Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul was chosen as a war leader. He looked like a war leader. He was head and shoulders taller than others, and he would succeed in preserving the Israelites against the threat of the Philistines, a rival people who had come to settle on the coastline and were pushing like the tide ever higher into the hill country where the Israelites had their center of population and power. Saul's dynasty didn't last long, as he was defeated by the Philistines, and he was supplanted by an unassuming subject by the name of David, who came from the tribe of Judah. And David would move the capital right on the border of the territory of Judah and Benjamin to a site known as Jerusalem. It was an old city. Now, for 7 years, David was recognized as king of Judah, and his capital was in Hebron, but eventually all the tribes recognized that they could benefit under this war leader, and he would extend Israel's territory to its greatest extent and make them a powerful regional figure. He's able to do this as the great world powers of Mesopotamia and Egypt were at that time weak, and he's going to be succeeded by his sons. Now, David's not a perfect king, a great warrior, but certainly there's some dysfunction that's evidenced in his family as he acts like he's above the law. We'll find that that's an issue in their history. But he's going to establish Jerusalem as the capital, and his son Solomon, who succeeds him, will eventually build the great temple. So these are the great accomplishments of this period of the United Monarchy, is the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital city, the acquisition of a unified territory, and the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. Solomon's son Rehoboam wasn't as wise as his famous father, and the result was that he split the kingdom. As the tribes identified with each other, many of the tribes didn't think that they were well represented, and so they would rebel and divide away, led by a usurper by the name of Jeroboam. And so the united monarchy of the Hebrews is split into the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah. This these two rival kingdoms will coexist in this time period from about 930 until the year 722. During this period of rival kingdoms, we find is that God raises up prophets calling people to faithfulness, and there's a struggle to remain faithful and distinctive as they're called to be within the land that God had given them in Canaan. Sometimes they had competition with closely related peoples who lived along their borders. Eventually, the great world powers would rise up and aspire to control Canaan, and the first large power that we see doing this is going to be the Assyrians. So all the little kingdoms that once struggled with each other basically now face a serious threat from Mesopotamia with the Assyrian people. The Assyrians dominate the area, and the Israelites learn to live under Assyrian domination. And at times they find their faith is challenged in that context, and the Lord raises up a variety of prophets who lead them during this time period of Assyrian oppression. Eventually, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to the Assyrians in the year 722 BC, and they're taken into captivity, and they largely lose their identity. The southern kingdom of Israel, of the Israelites, is the kingdom of Judah, and it persists following the Assyrian capture of Samaria. They become a subject people to the Assyrians, but they don't like it, and so as a result they rebel against them at times, and the Assyrians will seek to maintain their subjugation. The next period of Hebrew history is that of the Babylonian captivity, where the Neo-Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II defeat the Assyrians and push their control towards Egypt. In the year 605, Jerusalem becomes subject to the Babylonians and maintains something of its independence under the Babylonians, but when they rebel in 597, the Babylonians show them once again who's boss, and when they rebel again in the year 587, the Babylonians come and will besiege the city of Jerusalem and destroy the city. It's in that context that you have the prophet Jeremiah providing revelation from God to these people. The Babylonians take captive the cultural elites, first of all in 805, subsequently in 897, and then again, as I said before, destroy the city in 587. So the prophet Daniel and his young men from the cultural elites of Jerusalem, we had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were taken in the year 605 to Babylon. Subsequently, in 597, we have people like the prophet Ezekiel, who's taken captive to Babylon and lives by the banks of the river Kebar, and tells the Israelites not to rebel against the Babylonians, but to submit to their authority, as this is judgment from God. They don't listen to this warning, and subsequently they'll pay the price with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. But they do have the promise that they're going to continue to exist and to be a blessing to all peoples. And so the Babylonian captivity is a period, depending on how you measure it here, if you begin in 605, it's a period that lasts for 70 years. And eventually the Babylonians will be supplanted by another people group. This is an alliance of the Medes and the Persians. The final period of Hebrew history recorded in the Old Testament is that of the period of the Persians. The Persians dominated Egypt from the 5th century all the way up until the 3rd century. So there's a period, nice round numbers, about 200 years, where the Persians dominate the world until the coming of the Greeks under Alexander of Macedonia. The Persians followed a policy of allowing subject peoples to return to their homelands, and this was true also for the Israelites. they allowed for the restoration of the people of Judah. Zerubbabel and the priest Joshua led a group of individuals around the year 538 out of the Persian territories, the Persian heartland, and they went back to the land of Canaan and lived in Judah. As they lived in Judah, certainly they didn't have all the cultural fluorescence that had been possible under Solomon. But something that they would do early on is to establish the altar, and then at the instigation of a variety of prophets, eventually they'd get around to building the temple. It wasn't as grand, as nicely appointed as the earlier temple of Solomon, but they reinstituted their worship and their identity. Along the way, they found their culture to continue to be challenged, and God raised up prophets like Ezra, who brought people back from Babylon to Judea, and there they called the people to maintain their cultural identity, and this ongoing struggle for holiness persisted in Judea. God, in His providence, raised up a individual in the person of Nehemiah, who was a cupbearer to the king, and who was eventually going to be appointed as governor over Judea. And he came to see what was going on, as he had heard various stories about the plight of his people back in Judea, and God worked through him in 2 governorships to see the walls of Jerusalem restored and the identity of the people secured. So, under the Persians, the Israelites maintained their cultural practices, their identity, and preserved their influence in world history. Now, as we look through all these periods of Hebrew history, what we find is there's a number of challenges. As I've already suggested, one of the challenges was retaining their cultural identity. They lived in a world where there's lots of various ideas that were afoot, and they were subject to religious syncretism. That would be blending their ideas with the ideas of the people around them. Now, they were called to be distinctive. They had a promise made to Abraham, and later what we find under Moses is that they were given laws which would make them distinctive. This would affect their everyday life, from the types of things they ate, to their values, as we think about the coming of the 10 Commandments under Moses. These would establish some cultural distinctives amongst the Israelites. The question would be, would they retain that? Would they keep their focus on worshiping Yahweh, or would they worship Yahweh in ways that He didn't want to be worshipped, such as using idols? Throughout this long period of history, what we see is they maintain their cultural identity. Not that everybody does that, but the group as a whole does retain this. Now, as they live in Canaan, Canaan is an interesting place because it's located on that land bridge between Egypt in Africa and the great civilizations of Mesopotamia in Asia. As a result, being located along a superhighway, they were subject to a whole lot of ideas that passed through as they're there along that trade route, a natural route of communication. Now, the people of Judah living up in the mountains weren't quite as accessible as the people of Samaria, as the major highway traveled through the northern kingdom, and the capital city of Samaria headed to parts north. But this would be a challenge to maintain their identity amongst all the different things that passed by, and the people that lived around them, the various Canaanite religions that people held to, worshiping Baal and the like. Amongst the Israelites, another challenge was to maintain social justice. We find that they were a socially stratified society where they had priests, and they had people who were slaves. But in Israelite society, slavery was something that was not perpetual for non-Jews, and it was a position where people were protected. This would be different from the slavery of surrounding societies. The Israelites certainly had a family structure that was very important, and this helped build political structures of the tribes. And this group of people were held together by having a shared history, language, and religion. There would be regional linguistic dialectical variations that emerged, and sometimes there's civil wars that emerge in their history. But they would maintain political unity as they come to have a singular king. And they had, again, some cultural things that would tie them together. But these people oftentimes suffered political and cultural oppression from surrounding groups of people and world powers that sought to dominate them. And this would be one of their challenges, to hold on to the promises of God while maintaining their identity and their personal holiness. As we study Western civilization, though, we're interested particularly on the influence of these ancient Hebrews and Israelites, their successors, on ancient Near Eastern civilization. The Israelites had influence in the land where they lived all along the way. What we find is they had some influence on the Canaanites. Perhaps we might see also some influence in Egypt as they go to Egypt. What we find in Egypt is that there's some religious changes that take place with increasing democratization of the afterlife. We also see in the New Kingdom various reforms under Akhenaten. He tried to change Egyptian religion so that they would have the major god Aten instead of Amun worship. And there are some items there that seem to reflect perhaps some influence on the Egyptians. Now, some people try to think that perhaps Atenism was something that helped to form Moses' ideas, but the problem is that Abraham and Moses were there long before Akhenaten ruled Egypt. And so the direction of influence must be of that which is earlier to that which is later. And so if there is any influence, it would be from the Hebrews bringing influence and focusing on a singular God rather than many gods, rather than the Egyptians teaching that to the Israelites. Now, the Israelites perhaps might be seen as having some influence on other ancient Near Eastern civilizations like those in Mesopotamia. What we do find in the biblical text is that there was some small influence that Daniel would have with the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar, but Nebuchadnezzar never seems to repent of his polytheism, and certainly his successors didn't either. But as we move to Mesopotamia, what we find is that amongst the Persians was the emergence of the prophet Zoroaster, and Zoroaster very clearly believed in a coming judgment. And some people, like your textbook writer Spielvogel, try to assert that the Israelites learned their ideas about coming judgment from Zoroaster. This clearly isn't the case. As we read in the Old Testament, we find that the idea of judgment existed before Zoroaster came to be a prophet amongst the Persians. As we're studying Western Civ here, though, we're most interested in the influence of the Hebrews on Western civilization. The area of greatest influence would be in the area of religion and philosophy. The Hebrew were monotheists. They worshipped the one God, Yahweh. Subsequently, three great world religions worship this singular God in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Other areas of influence that the Israelites have on Western civilization would be in the area of law and justice. Under the prophet Moses, God revealed the Ten Commandments and many other distinctive rules for the Jews. But in the Ten Commandments, sometimes known as the Decalogue, what we find is there's laws that are made which relate between God and people and their fellow man. As we look at the ancient Hebrew laws, what we find is that people were supposed to be equal before the law. This stands in distinction between the laws of the Israelites and the laws of other people, their neighbors, the Mesopotamians, like Hammurabi, for example, where there was a stratification of people before the law. What we find in the laws of the Israelites was the protection of the individual and individual private property. We find also taught in their laws social responsibility, even for people who are different from yourself, people who are aliens, outsiders. They had protections under the law. And so this would be something that the Israelites are going to pass on to subsequent people groups, and is a major contributor to Western civilization. While we think about justice being something that is hopefully going to promote peace within society, we do find that one of the principles that's at work there is retribution, where wrongdoers are punished. And we're concerned in our society that the punishment fit the crime, and that laws be fair. These are ideas that come from the Hebrew of old and greatly affect Western civilization. Another idea that we find emerging in Hebrew society is that of government, and something that shaped governments in Western society for a long time was the idea of monarchy. Now, there had been monarchs before the Hebrews. Certainly they observed this in the peoples around them. But this would be something that will be a model that people will look to, and we'll find later on in Western civilization that people will make appeals to the divine right of kings, that God is particularly working through kings to accomplish His purposes, and kings should thereby be obeyed. As we think about the Hebrews' influence on Western society, the area of morality and ethics is an area of great significance. In Hebrew society, human life is valued. People are valued. It's not one of the 10 Commandments, but certainly what we find Jesus saying later is that, and what we can find in the ancient Mosaic writings, is that you're supposed to love your neighbor. Interaction between people and each other, and people and God, are very important in Hebrew society, and this is going to be a subject that will be the focus of a great deal of discussion in Western society. In influencing Western society, the Hebrew scriptures produced by the prophets, led by God's Spirit, provide a basic piece of literature that people will go to throughout much of Western society, and this will be fundamental reading for anybody who wants to understand Western society. Particularly coming from the Hebrew would be the Old Testament, those books of their history and law, their poetry, their wisdom writing, and that of the prophets. The Israelites have a fundamental impact in shaping Western society. Without their understanding, revealed by God in the Scriptures, that God exists, that the world is real, Western society wouldn't be the same. We wouldn't have science, for example. If the world's not really real, as some people would believe in Eastern societies, then you don't have the development of science. So this is going to be a fundamental belief. The thought that you're answerable to God, that there's going to be coming judgment, is a fundamental belief that is going to shape Western society. Now, the Israelites didn't live in a vacuum, and there were many other of these later Near Eastern peoples that had influence on Western civilization and had some influence on the Israelites.
amongst the Canaanites, the Canaanitish people, one of those people groups would be the Phoenicians along the coast. And something that the Israelites do is they write down their scriptures, and they're able to do this, particularly as they develop alphabetic style writing, and that appears to develop early on amongst the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are going to be the great purveyors of the idea of alphabetic writing. As they trade around the Mesopotamian, these Canaanitish people who live along the coast are going to take their ideas about writing using an alphabet as far away as places like Carthage in North Africa, and they're going to have influence amongst the Greeks in the Balkan Peninsula. So this is going to be an important cultural contribution that comes out of the Levant here, something that the Hebrew benefit from, and other people groups are going to benefit from here in the later Near Eastern context that we've been talking about today. They take a lot of ideas that are not terribly productive as well. Some of their religious ideas, what we'll find is that those Phoenicians going to North Africa will take their false religion with them. And the result is we have names in history like Hannibal. The worship of Baal is taken there, and they have infant sacrifice and the like that they practiced in North Africa. The Phoenicians are an interesting group of people who lived along the coast just north of the land of Canaan where the Israelites lived, and they didn't have great open plains in which to grow great crops, and so their strategy for subsistence was that of trade, and they engaged in shipbuilding. Using the timbers that grew from the cedars of Lebanon, they built great ships that they'd ply the waters of the Mediterranean, and this is how they made their livelihood, was by trading things along the coast of the Mediterranean. And along the way, they took cultural knowledge and spread it westward across the Mediterranean, and built up greater and greater confidence in navigation of the Mediterranean. They developed some techniques which would be very important to people. Amongst the goods that they would produce in their trade was that of dyed textiles using the murex shell. They particularly developed a very beautiful color-fast dye that was purple, blue, and was treasured around the Mediterranean. Some other things that they take is the idea of the writing material of papyrus. Our word Bible is connected in some ways to the word biblos, our idea of book, as they are going to take the use of papyrus as a writing material that they'll spread to other places along the way. So in the Mediterranean, we're going to have the Phoenicians, who are very important in transferring cultural developments and promoting craft specialization. We find these people as being particularly influential amongst the Israelites, as they are going to provide the huge timbers that are needed for the construction of the temple by Solomon, and some of the craftsmanship that is brought by craftsmen in the construction of that structure will depend upon craftsmen that come from the northern part of Israel, where their territory abuts that of the Phoenicians. Now there's a number of other ancient people groups that were contemporaries with the Hebrew and that do make small contributions to Western civilization. Sometimes it's a matter of preserving that which went ahead. The Assyrians that we've talked about were certainly famous for their engineering as applied to warfare, as they engaged in siege warfare by building ramps up against walls or by mining underneath walls. Their organizational structure would be something that's important, as they conquered many different peoples. But one of the things that they did is they appreciated writing, and they preserved writings from people that they conquered. Sometimes they made their own Akkadian copies of earlier texts, and so we have sometimes bilingual texts that are preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal. This will be one of their contributions. While they destroyed much, they did preserve selected items that they valued, and so they will be people who pass on the history of the Sumerians, for example, and the earlier Mesopotamian peoples to us, as thousands of these clay tablets that they wrote have been preserved. Now, in the time of Tiglath-Pileser III, the Assyrians moved from speaking Akkadian to speaking Aramean, and this will be the language that will continue to be used in much of the Persian Empire and in the time of Jesus. The Assyrians are described in the scriptures as being the rod of God's anger. God uses them to discipline his people as they lived in the land of Canaan, particularly when they failed to recognize who he is and his claim on their lives. Another people group that influenced Western civilization would be the Persians. The Persians learned from people that they subjugated and developed some ideas that they used across their empire. One of the things they developed was uniform metrology, weights and measures. And as they facilitated trade, something they took from the Lydians, the people that lived in western Turkey as we know it today, was the idea of coinage. They popularized the use of coinage, where you have precious metals that are stamped into coins, and this would facilitate trade. They particularly, in the time of Darius, developed something known as the derrick. Another item that the Persians developed was their system of communications. They don't develop their road system quite so extensively as later on the Romans will, but they developed this idea that there should be good roads to facilitate communication within their widespread multi-ethnic empire. And so they developed a post road that went from Susa in what is today Iran all the way to Sardis in western Turkey. Their motto on this road is something that's been adopted by the U.S. Postal Service as an unofficial motto, that nothing's going to get in the way of the delivery of the mail. Doesn't matter whether it's bad weather or various types of adversity, the mail must go through. The Persians are an interesting group of people that God used in preserving the Israelites. They have to work to maintain their cultural distinctive against the cultural pressure of the Persians and against the economic adversities that are there, but they're going to persist in doing so, and as a result, the Hebrew influence will persist. So as we think about this time period, we recognize is that while this was long ago, there's some very fundamental things that come out of this later period of ancient Near Eastern roots that establish Western civilization.